Padre Pio saw 3 demons standing at the foot of a young friar's bed, and the young friar did not even know they were there. He was sleeping peacefully, or so he believed. But Padre Pio, passing by that cell at 3 o'clock in the morning on his way to the chapel, stopped. He placed his bandaged hand against the wooden door, and through that door, with those eyes that seemed permitted by God to behold what ordinary eyes could not bear, he saw them, 3 shadows, darker than the darkness of the room. They stood around the bed like cruel physicians around a helpless patient, and they were whispering, not with voices that could be heard by the ear, but with that hidden language which sinks directly into the mind. Words of doubt, words of despair, words chosen carefully to weaken the foundation of a young man's faith before he even opened his eyes. Padre Pio did not knock. He did not shout. He did not make a spectacle of the battle. The saints do not waste force when humility will do. He leaned close to the narrow crack between the door and the frame, and he whispered 5 words. 5 words he had whispered every morning of his life, for decades. 5 words that had sustained him through years of demonic assaults, so violent that the other friars could hear furniture being hurled against the walls of his cell at night. And these were not mere images. Brother Modestino, who served Padre Pio for years, would later testify that he had seen the marks on Padre Pio's body. Not only the sacred wounds of the stigmata, but bruises, scratches, welts, and signs of suffering that appeared overnight, as if some unseen hatred had beaten him while the monastery slept. On one occasion in 1947, the friars found Padre Pio on the floor of his cell at dawn. His habit was torn, his pillow lay across the room. Deep scratches marked his arms, scratches that had not been there the night before. When they lifted him gently to his feet, he said only, "They came again last night, more of them this time. They are angry because of the conversions. The more souls that come back to God through my confessional, the angrier they become. But they cannot win, they never win. Not as long as the Holy Family stands between them and me." There is a lesson hidden in those words. The devil is furious when a soul returns to grace. He does not rage because of human success, applause, or reputation. He rages because one soul has been drawn back to Christ, because one confession has washed away what he had labored for years to build. Hell trembles at repentance. On another occasion, Father Agostino recorded that the sounds from Padre Pio's cell were so terrible that 3 young friars fled the corridor in fear. They heard what seemed to be a man dragged across the floor, the crash of furniture, the sound of heavy chains striking wood. Then, always at the darkest moment, when the violence reached its height and it seemed as if whatever was inside that room would tear it apart, there came a whisper. Padre Pio's voice, barely audible through the door. 5 words, and then silence. Not a gradual quieting, not a fading struggle. Silence, total and absolute, as if the room itself had been emptied of everything that was not peace. The moment those 5 words left Padre Pio's lips and entered that young friar's room, the 3 shadows recoiled. They did not withdraw slowly. They fled. Like vermin exposed to sudden light, they vanished in an instant. The young friar slept on, unaware that a battle had been fought and won beside his bed. And in the morning, when he awoke, he felt something he had not felt in many weeks. Peace. Real peace. The kind of peace that settles deep in the bones, like warmth from a fire. He did not know why it had come, but Padre Pio knew. And now I must tell you what those 5 words were and why they carry a power so many Catholics have forgotten. But before the words are given, the story must be understood. Words without understanding can become mere sounds, and sounds without faith become noise. The power was not in a formula, as if prayer were magic. God forbid. The power was in the reality those words invoked, in the humility with which they were spoken, in the holy door they opened, and the dark door they closed. To understand that, we must go back to San Giovanni Rotondo in the winter of 1957, when a young Capuchin friar named Brother Jacomao arrived at the monastery with a suitcase full of books and a heart full of doubt. The monastery of Our Lady of Grace sat on a ridge above the little town, like a stone ship anchored beneath the sky. In 1957, San Giovanni Rotondo was not yet the great pilgrimage center it would later become. There was no vast flow of visitors as in later years, no grand movement of buses and crowds. It was still a small, wind-beaten Apulian town, surrounded by olive groves, rocky pastures, and the silence of the Gargano. The monastery above it seemed ancient, severe, and immovable, like the mountain itself. When Brother Jacomao stepped off the bus that January afternoon, carrying his suitcase in one hand and a volume of St. Thomas Aquinas in the other, the first thing he noticed was the cold. Not only the physical cold, though the Gargano wind cut through his habit like a blade, but another cold, a heaviness in the air around the monastery which he could not name. The second thing he noticed was the pilgrims. Even in winter, even with the wind howling and the roads half frozen, there were people waiting outside the monastery gates. Some had come from Naples, some from Rome, some from Sicily. They had come to see Padre Pio, to attend his Mass, to confess to him, to ask his prayers for sick mothers, broken marriages, wandering children, tormented consciences. Brother Jacomao looked at them and felt something between pity and contempt. They believed this old friar could see into their souls. They believed he could read their sins before they spoke them. They believed he bore the wounds of Christ in his own flesh. Jacomao believed none of it. He had come to study, to serve the order, to fulfill his mother's dream. He had not come to chase miracles. Brother Jacomao was 24 years old. He had entered the Capuchin order 3 years earlier, not because his vocation burned like fire in his breast, but because his mother had begged him. She was a devout woman from a village near Assisi, and she had always hoped that one of her sons would become a priest. Jacomao was the fourth of 6 children, the quiet one, the bookish one, the boy who kept his nose in theology and church history while his brothers played football in the piazza. He had entered partly to please her, and partly because he truly loved the intellectual life of the church. He loved theology, philosophy, the great questions of grace and freedom, the nature of God, the beauty of doctrine, the precision of the mind when it bows before truth. But what he did not love, what he had never experienced, and frankly did not believe in, was the supernatural. He believed in God, certainly. He believed in the sacraments. He believed in the church. But demons, angels, mystical visions, stigmata, spiritual attacks in the night, he considered these, at best, metaphors, poetic language for psychological states. Dramatic descriptions of temptation, religious imagery handed down from simpler times. He did not believe that actual beings of darkness prowled the corridors of monasteries at night. He thought that was medieval nonsense. During his novitiate, he had written a paper arguing that the gospel accounts of demonic possession were metaphors for mental illness. His superiors had praised it for clarity and intellectual rigor. He was proud of that paper. He brought a copy with him to San Giovanni Rotondo, tucked inside his volume of Aquinas. Later, he would burn that paper in the monastery fireplace. But not yet. At first he believed he was right, and the pilgrims outside the gate were simple souls caught in superstition. He believed this until his 3rd night in San Giovanni Rotondo. On his 3rd night, Brother Jacomao awoke at 2 o'clock in the morning to a sound he could not explain. A scratching, not on the wall, not on the floor, inside his mind. It was as if something with claws were trying to scratch its way into his thoughts. He lay in bed, paralyzed not only by fear, but by confusion. He was a rational man. He did not believe in these things, and yet the scratching was there, real, insistent, undeniable. Then came a voice. Not a voice he heard with his ears, but one that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside his own skull. You do not belong here. You have no vocation. Your mother forced you. You are a fraud, a pretender. God does not want you. The priesthood does not want you. Go home. Brother Jacomao pulled the blanket over his head like a child hiding from a storm. He lay there trembling until the first pale light of dawn entered through the small window of his cell. Then the scratching stopped. In the morning, he told himself it had been a dream. Stress, nerves, a new place, his anxious mind playing tricks upon him. Nothing supernatural, nothing to confess, nothing to fear. But the next night, it happened again. The same scratching, the same voice, the same words. You do not belong here. Go home. And the night after that, and the night after that. Every night for 3 weeks, Brother Jacomao awoke at 2 o'clock in the morning to the scratching and the voice. Every morning, he told himself it was nothing. But each morning, it became harder to believe the lie he told himself. Because he was changing. He could feel it. The doubt that had once been a quiet companion, a gentle intellectual skepticism, was becoming something more bitter. It was no longer a question that sought truth. It was becoming a wound that rejected light. It did not merely ask whether God's plan was real. It began to hate the very possibility that it was. He found himself unable to pray. The Psalms, which he had loved for their poetry, became ash in his mouth. The Mass, which he had admired for its structure and beauty, began to seem like an empty ritual performed by men deceiving themselves. He was losing his faith, not slowly, not naturally, but rapidly, like a boat taking on water in the dark. No theological argument could plug the holes. This is how the enemy often works. He does not always come with noise and terror. Sometimes he comes with fatigue, dryness, contempt, and a false clarity that says, you have finally seen the truth. But it is not truth. It is desolation, dressed as intelligence. I remember something similar in my own home, though not with scratching in the night. When my son passed through a crisis of faith at 17, I watched the same terrible speed. 1 week he served at the altar. The next week he refused to go to Mass. Soon after, he told me that religion was for weak people. I remember thinking, this is not a natural progression. This is not simply a teenager growing older. Something is pulling him away, not from outside, but from within, from a place beneath his thoughts. Years later, after he returned to the church following a visit to San Giovanni Rotondo of all places, he told me what it had felt like. He said, "Mom, it was like someone turned off the light inside me, like someone reached into my chest and flipped a switch. Everything that had been warm and bright and true suddenly became cold and dark and meaningless. And I could not turn it back on, no matter how hard I tried." That is what the enemy does. He does not always debate theology. He reaches for the switch. By the 4th week, Brother Jacomao had decided to leave. He would pack his suitcase, take the morning train, and return to his mother's village near Assisi. He would tell her he was sorry. He would find another path. Teaching, perhaps. Scholarship. Something respectable. Something that did not require him to believe in things he could no longer feel. His decision was made. It was final. And he was almost at peace. Almost, because one detail troubled him. One detail did not fit his rational explanation. If the scratching and the voice were only the product of his anxious mind, why did they always stop at exactly the same time? Not at dawn. Not when he lit a candle. Not when he forced himself to sit upright. They stopped at precisely 4:15 inches the morning. Every night, at 4:15, the scratching ceased. The voice went silent, and something else entered the room, a feeling of calm, warmth, presence. Brother Jacomao, despite all his rationalism, could only describe it as if someone had walked into the room and the darkness had simply retreated. He mentioned this to an older friar named Brother Leone during breakfast one morning. He tried to say it casually, as if it were an oddity rather than a crisis of the soul. 4:15, he said. Strange time. I wonder what happens at 4:15. Brother Leone looked at him over his coffee cup. Then he smiled, not with amusement, but with the grave tenderness of a man who has lived long beside mysteries. 4:15, he said, is when Padre Pio gets out of bed. Brother Jacomao stared at him. Every morning, for decades. At 4:15, Padre Pio rises, and the first thing he does, before he puts on his sandals, before he lights his candle, before his eyes are fully open, is whisper a phrase, the same phrase, every morning, for as long as anyone can remember. Brother Jacomao felt something shift within him. What phrase? Brother Leone shook his head. I have never been close enough to hear the exact words, but I will tell you this. Whatever he says, it changes the air. The whole monastery feels different after 4:15. Before then, especially in the darkest hours, there is heaviness, tension. Sometimes we hear sounds in the corridors that should not be there, footsteps where no one walks, doors opening where no one enters. But at 4:15, when Padre Pio whispers those words, everything changes, the heaviness lifts, the tension dissolves, and until nightfall, the monastery is at peace. It is as if his words draw a line that darkness cannot cross. That night, Brother Jacomao did not sleep, not because of the scratching, because of a decision. Instead of fleeing, he would investigate. He would discover what Padre Pio whispered at 4:15. He approached it with the same intellectual determination that had made him a brilliant student of theology. This was now a question to be answered, and Jacomao was very good at answering questions. For the next week, he woke every morning at 4 o'clock and positioned himself in the corridor outside Padre Pio's cell. The corridor was dark at that hour. There were no electric lights in those private quarters. The monastery still lived by candles, oil lamps, and the slow discipline of poverty. At 4 in the morning, the only light came from the thin moon filtering through the high windows at the end of the passage. Brother Jacomao stood with his back against the cold stone wall, his bare feet numb on the tile floor, his breath rising in little clouds in the January air. He pressed his ear against the wall, he held his breath, and he listened. On the first morning, he heard nothing, only the wind outside and the quiet settling of old stone. On the second morning, he arrived earlier, at 3:45, and heard the distant sound of movement inside Padre Pio's cell, a creak, a soft groan of pain. Padre Pio's wounds bled freshly every night, and the simple act of rising from bed was an agony the old friar endured without complaint. Jacomao stood there listening to an old man suffer, and he felt a strange stirring within himself. Not curiosity, compassion. On the third morning, he placed himself directly beside the doorframe. He heard the shuffle of feet on wood, the faint clink of rosary beads being lifted from a nightstand, slow and labored breathing. But no words. The monastery walls were too thick. Centuries of stone and plaster swallowed sound. On the fourth morning, he pressed a drinking glass against the wall, as he had once read spies did in novels. It did not help. On the fifth morning, he borrowed a stethoscope from the monastery infirmary and placed it against the stone. He heard Padre Pio's heartbeat, slow and steady. He heard fabric rustle, still no phrase. On the 8th morning, Brother Jacomao did something bold, something that could have led to his being sent away from the monastery. He crept to Padre Pio's door and pressed his ear directly against the wood. And this time, in the silence of 4:15, while the world itself seemed to hold its breath, he heard it, Padre Pio's voice, barely a whisper. Hoarse from sleep and years of suffering, yet clear enough for Jacomao to understand. 5 words in Latin. 5 words he recognized at once, not because they were rare, not because they were hidden, not because they were difficult, but because they were simple. So simple that a serious theologian might pass them by without a second glance. And there was the reversal. There was the humbling blow. The phrase that kept demons at bay, the phrase that changed the air of an entire monastery, the phrase that had guarded Padre Pio through decades of violent spiritual warfare, was not a secret prayer from an ancient manuscript. It was not a formula known only to mystics and exorcists. It was not an obscure teaching preserved in silence from century to century. It was 5 words every Catholic child could learn. Words so simple that many stop saying them because they imagine they have outgrown them. Jesus, Maria, Joseph, adiuvatemi. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. That is all. 5 words. An invocation of the Holy Family. A prayer grandmothers teach grandchildren. A prayer many adults abandon because it seems too small, too childlike, too unsophisticated for a mature faith. And yet this was the prayer Padre Pio, the great mystic, the wounded priest, the confessor of souls, the man who battled demons in the night, chose to whisper before anything else every morning. Not first a long formula, not first a learned meditation, not first a prayer designed to impress heaven. 5 simple words: Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. Brother Jacomao stood in the corridor with his ear against the door, and something collapsed inside him. Not his faith, his pride. That hidden pride which had made him believe prayer must be complex to be powerful. That pride which thought devotion must be analyzed before it could be trusted. That pride which measures the things of God by the size of human thoughts. There, in the cold corridor, at 4:15 inches the morning, with the echo of those 5 words still trembling in the stone around him, Brother Jacomao understood what all his years of study had not taught him. The strength of prayer does not come from the complexity of the words. It comes from the humility of the heart that speaks them. A child who says, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me, with true trust, sends a prayer to heaven more powerful than a theologian's most brilliant treatise uttered with pride. God does not weigh words as men weigh them. God weighs hearts. And a humble heart is heavier than all the books in all the libraries of the world. This is what Padre Pio knew. This is what he lived every day. In a monastery filled with learned men, surrounded by volumes of theology, philosophy, canon law, and sacred doctrine, the most powerful weapon against darkness was a 5-word prayer any child could say. And perhaps the reason so many Catholics do not experience its power is not that the prayer has failed, it is that they have stopped saying it. They have outgrown it, or so they think. They have moved on to devotions that feel more impressive. They have forgotten that heaven often bends most quickly toward the small, the poor, the childlike, and the one who simply says, help me. Now listen carefully, because what happened next is where the story becomes personal for every soul. Brother Jacomao returned to his cell. He did not pack his suitcase. He did not take the morning train. He did not prepare his explanation for his mother. Instead, he knelt on the cold stone floor of his cell, and for the first time since arriving in San Giovanni Rotondo, he prayed. Not a scholarly prayer, not a theological prayer, not a prayer composed to sound worthy. He said 5 words, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. He said them once. Then again, then again and again, like breathing in and breathing out. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. And something happened. Brother Giacomo would later describe it in a letter to his mother, a letter discovered decades afterward in family archives and published by a church historian in 2003. He wrote that he could not explain what had happened. He had knelt in his cell and said the simplest prayer he knew, the prayer his mother had taught him when he was 5 years old. As he spoke the words, the room changed. The heaviness that had pressed upon him for 4 weeks lifted, not gradually, all at once, like a stone rolled away from a tomb. And in the space where the heaviness had been, something else entered. Light. Not the light from the window, another kind of light. A light felt more than seen, and in that light the doubt dissolved, not because he had suddenly answered every theological question, but because the questions themselves lost their power to torment him. The certainty that came was not intellectual. It was deeper than thought. It was the certainty of a child who knows his mother is in the room, even with his eyes closed. From that morning on, the scratching never returned. Not once. Not in all the years that followed. Brother Jacomao remained in San Giovanni Rotondo. He was ordained a priest. He served in the monastery for 41 years. He never transferred. He never requested a different assignment. When his superiors offered him a prestigious teaching position at a seminary in Rome, he declined. When they offered him a parish of his own in Campania, he declined again. He wanted to remain in the place where he had learned the most important lesson of his life. And every morning at 4:15, without exception, in sickness and in health, in joy and in grief, in winter cold and summer heat, he whispered the same 5 words Padre Pio whispered: Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. He became known among the younger friars as the one whose cell was always peaceful. Other friars reported disturbances, sounds, presences, and the usual spiritual warfare that seemed to trouble the monastery, especially at night. But Brother Jacomo's cell remained quiet, calm, as if those 5 words, spoken each morning with humility and perseverance, had drawn a circle of protection around his room, which darkness could not penetrate. If this testimony touches your heart, receive it not as a curiosity, but as a warning and an invitation. The Lord does not give such stories to entertain souls. He gives them to wake us up. He gives them so that the proud may become humble, the frightened may become trusting, and the distracted may return to prayer. And if this work of sharing hidden spiritual teachings has helped you, support it with gratitude if you are able, not as one pays for grace cannot be bought, but as one helps the lamp remain lit for others walking in darkness. Every act offered with love, even a small one, has weight before God. It is not the size of the gift that matters, it is the humility behind it. Now here is what must be carried away from this story. Padre Pio did not whisper those 5 words once, and then cease. He whispered them every morning without exception. In rain or sun, in sickness or strength, in agony from the stigmata, or in rare moments of relief, every single morning. There is a reason. Spiritual protection is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice. You lock your front door each night before going to bed. You do not lock it once and then leave it open for the rest of your life, trusting that one old action will protect you forever. No. You lock it again because each night is new, and each night an intruder may try the door. The spiritual life is the same. Every morning is a new day. Every morning the enemy tests the perimeter. Every morning he tries the door. And the 5 words, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me, are like the lock, but the key must be turned each day. Padre Pio understood this with a clarity many never reach. He knew the spiritual battle is not won only by one dramatic victory. It is won by 1,000 quiet mornings, 1,000 whispered prayers, 1,000 small acts of humility repeated until they become as natural as breathing. He once told Brother Modestino, "The devil is not afraid of grand gestures. He is afraid of persistence. He can withstand a single prayer. He cannot withstand a soul that prays the same prayer every day for 50 years. That is the power of the 5 words. Not complexity, not novelty, not spiritual brilliance. Persistence, daily repetition, a humble, stubborn, childlike insistence on asking the Holy Family for help every morning, no matter what the mind feels, no matter what the heart suffers, no matter how dry the soul has become. Because there are mornings when you will feel nothing. Say it then. There are mornings when prayer feels foolish. Say it then. There are mornings when sin accuses you, when shame tells you to stay away, when the enemy whispers, you have no right to call upon them. Say it, then most of all. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. The sick child does not wait until he is clean and strong before calling his mother. He calls because he is weak. He calls because he cannot rise alone. So must the soul call. There is something else that must be known. The church historian who published Brother Jacomao's letter discovered that Padre Pio did not say the 5 words only once each morning. He said them 3 times, 3 repetitions. Once for Jesus, once for Mary, once for Joseph. And with each repetition, his voice grew softer, not louder. Softer, until the 3rd repetition was barely audible, even to someone standing close by. The historian once asked an elderly friar why Padre Pio grew quieter with each repetition rather than stronger in voice. The friar answered with words worth pondering for a lifetime. Because, with each repetition, the Holy Family drew closer. You do not need to shout at someone standing beside you. The first time, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph hear the call from heaven. The second time, they begin to move toward you. The third time, they are in the room with you. And when the Holy Family is in the room, even a whisper is enough. Even silence is enough. Their presence is the protection. The words are only the invitation. Think of that. The words are the invitation. The protection is the presence. The presence of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Those 5 words open the door and say, "Come in, I need you, I cannot do this alone." And they come, every time, without coldness, without contempt, without turning away from the poor soul that asks. They come because they were invited. They remain because they are wanted. This is a truth many forget. The Holy Family is not distant from the weakness of human life. Jesus sanctified the home. Mary sanctified obedience and sorrow. Joseph sanctified labor, silence, vigilance, and fatherly protection. They know the small rooms of human existence. They know fatigue, fear, poverty, uncertainty, exile, hidden sacrifice, and the need to trust God before the next step is visible. When you call upon them in the morning, you are not calling upon strangers. You are calling upon the family into which every Christian heart longs to be received. The historian also discovered that these 5 words did not remain inside the walls of San Giovanni Rotondo. They spread quietly, as all truly powerful things often do. Not through campaigns, not through loud announcements, not through official programs, through whispers, through one soul telling another. Brother Jacomao himself taught the practice to at least 40 young friars who came to the monastery over the decades. Those friars, when transferred to other monasteries across Italy and beyond, carried the 5 words with them like a little flame sheltered against the wind. Father Pellegrino, who later served at a parish in Foggia, began saying the 5 words every morning and reported that disturbances in the rectory, which had troubled 3 previous pastors, ceased completely within a week. A Capuchin sister in Pietrelcina, Padre Pio's hometown, learned the practice from a visiting friar and introduced it to her community. She wrote in her journal that they had been praying elaborate novenas and litanies for protection against a spiritual oppression that seemed to hang over the convent like fog. Nothing seemed to lift it. Then Sister Margarita taught them the 5 words. They began saying them together at 4:15 each morning in memory of Padre Pio, and the fog lifted. Not because their novenas had been wrong, not because litanies had no value. The Church's prayers are treasures, but they had forgotten something essential. The most powerful prayer is often the simplest one, the one that does not try to impress God, but merely asks for help. Like a child pulling on his mother's sleeve. That is what these 5 words are. A child pulling on the sleeve of the Holy Family. And the Holy Family looks down. They bend close. They answer. Because that is what a true family does when a child calls in need. Brother Jacomao died in 1998 at the age of 65. He had spent 41 years in San Giovanni Rotondo. In his final days, he was lucid and calm. The younger friars gathered around his bed. One of them, a novice who had been in the monastery less than a year and who was already struggling with the same doubts and disturbances that had tormented Jacomao decades earlier, leaned close and asked him, "Brother, what is the most important thing you have learned in 41 years?" Brother Jacomao smiled. It was the same knowing smile Brother Leone had given him long ago over the breakfast table, and with his last strength, barely audible, he whispered 5 words, "Every morning, never stop." Let me tell you what this means for you tonight. You do not need to be a mystic. You do not need to bear the stigmata. You do not need to see demons. You do not need to smell roses or receive visions. You do not need a single extraordinary gift. You need 5 words and the humility to say them every morning. Tomorrow morning when you wake, before you reach for your phone, before you make your tea or coffee, before your eyes fully open to the burdens of the day, whisper these words. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. Say them 3 times. Once for Jesus, once for Mary, once for Joseph. Say them softly. Not because softness has magic in it. There is no magic in Christian prayer. Say them softly because softness is often the sound of humility, and humility is the key that opens every door in heaven. Say them not as a test, but as surrender. Not as an experiment, but as trust. Not as superstition, but as faith. Say them when your soul is peaceful, and say them when your soul is troubled. Say them when you have prayed well, and say them when you have failed. Say them when you feel close to God, and say them when heaven feels far away. The prayer is not a reward for the strong, it is medicine for the weak. Commit to it not for one morning only, but as a daily practice for the rest of your life, every morning, without exception, without overthinking, without theological debate, without waiting until your heart feels worthy. 5 words, spoken by a humble heart into the silence of dawn. Padre Pio did it for decades. Brother Jacomao did it for 41 years. And the demons could not stay. Not because the words were powerful in themselves, as though syllables commanded heaven by force, but because the presence they invoked is infinitely stronger than any darkness that has ever existed or ever will exist. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the Holy Family, the home of God on earth, the terror of hell because they belong completely to God. Now I ask you to make this prayer your own. Let it not remain a story you heard and admired. Let it enter the first breath of your morning. Let it stand at the threshold of your day like a lamp before the door. The enemy loves a soul that wakes distracted, angry, rushed, and unguarded. He loves the morning that begins with noise. He loves the heart that reaches first for the world and only later, if at all, for God. Do not give him that advantage. Before the world speaks, let heaven hear you. Before fear speaks, call upon Jesus. Before anxiety tightens the chest, call upon Mary. Before the burdens of labor and responsibility rise before you, call upon Joseph. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. There is no shame in needing help. The shame is pretending you do not need it. The proud soul stands alone and is easily surrounded. The humble soul calls for help and is never abandoned. Write in the comments, if you are ready, I commit to 5 words. And if you already have a morning prayer, share it, not to boast, but to strengthen others. Let the place where these words are read become, in its own little way, a wall of prayer the enemy cannot breach. And remember Padre Pio, who promised his spiritual children that he would not enter heaven until all of them had entered before him. Think of him watching over souls with wounded hands, with a heart consumed by love for Christ, with his whispered prayer still echoing through the corridors of that monastery on the mountain. He does not call you to fear. He calls you to vigilance. He does not call you to despair. He calls you to confession, to prayer, to humility, to trust. He calls you to return to the simple weapons you may have abandoned because the world taught you to be clever, sophisticated, self-sufficient, and spiritually careless. Become little again. Become poor before God. Become the child who knows where to run when darkness gathers. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. Say it tonight. Say it tomorrow. Say it every morning for the rest of your life. Say it when the house is quiet. Say it when the room feels heavy. Say it when temptation waits. Say it when doubt scratches at the mind. Say it when you cannot explain what is happening within you. Say it because help has been promised to the humble. Say it because the Holy Family still comes when called, and when they enter, darkness cannot remain. Jesus, Mary, Joseph, help me. God bless you and your family.